Hi, I'm Evelyn Farkas, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. Thank you so much for tuning in to the latest edition of Authors and Insights. This is a series that we've been holding for over a decade, featuring distinguished writers who are writing on something pertaining to international affairs, character-driven leadership, and the principles that John McCain believed in and espoused throughout his life. We are very honored today to have Anne Applebaum with us. Anne is a renowned prize-winning journalist and historian. She's a staff writer for the Atlantic Journal. She is also the author of numerous books, including A History of Ukraine, A History of the Soviet Gulags. Her bio is quite long, so I will not read it all, but suffice it to say that she is really one of the world's biggest experts, most well-known experts on democracy and on the threat that we face today from autocracies. Anne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here as a former fan of John McCain.
Your book presents an interesting perspective. So you talk about Autocracy Incorporated, right? So that's a corporate perspective on Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, etc. All of these autocracies in your book, you posit, are acting together in concert, but not because they agree on an ideology the way that we saw in the 20th century, whether they were fascists or communists or democracies, but in fact they are working closely together despite disagreements that they may have ideologically, because there are other things that unite them. And so can you talk to us about what the premise of your book is and why you thought it was important right now to explain that to the people of the world?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that's exactly right. My book is an attempt to explain why nationalist Russia and communist China and theocratic Iran and Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, why they would work together, why they cooperate, why they bail one another out, and why they help one another. And you can see this in many different ways. Venezuela, for example, is a state that probably would have collapsed years ago if it wasn't for Russian weapons, Chinese investment, Cuban help with security services, and even Iranian assistance with sanctions and oil technology. Think about Venezuela and Iran, from completely different parts of the world, nothing in common culturally or historically, and yet they work together. The Iranians have helped the Venezuelan regime, and the Venezuelans in turn have, for example, helped Hezbollah even get visas to travel around Europe. So I was looking at this group as a network, and I use the expression Autocracy Inc. because in my mind it works something like a large business conglomerate. They're separate companies, and each one of them has its own business model, but they cooperate at the macro level when it's in their interests. And I would say in large part they have three areas of interest. One of them is the one I think we've seen most clearly in the last few years, which is military. They will help one another in their various projects. They will help one another keep power, exert power, and that's been clearest obviously in Ukraine, where we saw the Iranians send drones and other kinds of weapons to the Russians to help them. We saw the North Koreans actually sending troops. I mean, I don't think we've spent enough time thinking about how weird it is that there were North Koreans fighting in Europe, but there were, and where the Chinese, through their, both through buying Russian energy, but also through sometimes covert but nevertheless real and important sales of components and parts, have kept the Russian defense industry going. So we see them helping one another militarily. We see them work together economically. So sometimes this looks like, I don't know, the quasi-state, quasi-private companies in one country invest in the quasi-state, quasi-private companies of another. So you see these, as I said, Iranian, Venezuelan deals or Chinese, Belarusian investments. And some of those investments are to make money for the owners. And very often the owners in this case are people who are also in politics. So in a country like Russia or in Belarus, the companies are both they're owned by people who also run the country. And that's very common in the autocratic world. So in some cases it's about making money. In some cases it's about politics. So they use their companies and their investments as ways of shoring one another up or fighting back against the United States or against Europe, as the case may be. And they also have a common way of using, what I would call the offshore economy. So most of us live in the real economy. We work under our real names, and if we own businesses, they're in our real names, and we submit to regulation and we pay taxes. There's also another world where people don't pay taxes. They keep their money in offshore bank accounts. They move their money around the world anonymously. They invest it anonymously. And this world has been very, very important to the maintenance of autocratic power in many countries. And also it's been important for the leaders of those countries, most of whom are billionaires. They're not just wealthy, they're very, very wealthy. It's been helpful in helping them hide their money and keep it in different parts of the world. That's one of the big differences actually between the dictatorships of the 21st century and those of the 21st century, is that they have money, and that gives them a certain different kind of power and a different kind of appeal. So when the Russians appeal to people in Europe or elsewhere, it's very often not because of, because as in the olden days, because of ideology. It's because of money, because they can pay. Thirdly, and this is maybe the most important piece of the story, they work together because they have a common enemy. And the common enemy is us. And by us, I mean people who live in the liberal democratic world, who use the language of liberal democracy. And by that, I mean accountability, transparency, the rule of law, rights, human rights, the belief in things like free press and free media. All of those things, all of those ideas are very threatening to modern autocrats because they live in societies where they are attempting to control everything. So they want to, they don't want independent courts. They want, instead of rule of law, they want rule by law. They want to, meaning the law is what whoever is in power says it is. They want to control as much of the information space as possible. They don't want to have a legitimate opposition of any kind. They don't want to recognize opposition. And because they seek to control these things, they find those ideas that come from our world very bothersome, mostly because they inspire their own people. I mean, because the Russian opposition was when it, in its most successful form, was an anti-corruption movement. The Hong Kong Democrats were a democracy movement. The Iranian women's movement was a rights movement. And all of those movements have real adherents and have real appeal inside the autocratic world. And at some point, starting about a decade ago, the leading autocracies began to see that they needed to push back against those ideas, not only at home, but everywhere. And so they do this by the creation of autocratic narratives that they repeat. They use the same propaganda techniques, which they imitate and they pass on to one another. The Chinese have created an incredible system of online and offline surveillance technology, which they sell to other states, who then make use of it. I don't think anybody's quite as good as the Chinese are, but a lot of others are trying to keep up. And they watch one another, how they use information, how they use propaganda, and how they use systems of control, and they imitate them and spread them, including into our societies. And I'll finish this by saying, one of the other big differences between the current day and the 20th century is that we aren't talking about some kind of divide like the Berlin Wall, where there's a wall and on one side are the communists and on one side are the Democrats and they're fighting each other. The battle between modern autocratic ideas and behaviors and modern democratic ideas and behaviors takes place everywhere, inside most countries, inside Russia, inside the US, inside most European countries, everywhere. And so there is a kind of war of ideas that's going on. And they, I think, understood this before we did, and they understood the importance of it before we did. And so, whereas I don't think that many Americans or, I don't know, Parisians or Londoners used to wake up in the morning worrying about what was going on in Moscow, there were a lot of people in Moscow who used to wake up in the morning, starting about 10 years ago, worrying about what we were doing and saying and thinking. And so the contest is with those countries, and it is a contest also, I should say, for power and influence in Africa and Asia and Latin America. But it's also, as I said, this contest of ideas.
So I think that's really interesting because it's almost you're expanding a little bit beyond what was in your book, because in your book you were talking about how the autocracies are united in opposing the democracies, if you will. They're opposed to freedom. They're opposed to their own opposition, small d Democrats. And I think, John McCain understood very clearly the power of freedom, of democracy, of the desire for peoples wherever they live to have more freedom and to have transparency and access to equal opportunity, if you will. And that is still obviously compelling, whether you call it democracy or something else.
And let me interrupt by saying I travel a lot and I travel to some weird places. I spent some time in the last year in Sudan. And I find almost everywhere I go, I meet people, even in very difficult societies, I was in a war zone in Sudan. And I talked to a group of younger people who were part of a kind of, it's called a mutual aid movement in Sudan, that is seeking to rebuild their society and do humanitarian work, even in this kind of terrible disaster of a collapsed state. And, people in that group said to me, they said, we know that the only solution in Sudan, the only long-term solution to our problem is some kind of democratic system. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect Jeffersonian democracy, but some system where everybody has rights and where this idea that one group takes everything and represses the other group, because that's what's happened in the past, and that's what the war is over now, where everybody finally understands that this system leads to a dead end. It's destroying the country. And as I said, they didn't come to this conclusion because they'd read the works of John McCain, or because the National Endowment of Democracy was lecturing to them, or because of they understood this intuitively because it made sense. And I find that, I was very struck a few years ago at the very end of the COVID epidemic. You may remember there were some demonstrations in Shanghai and in other Chinese cities that were also about, it was partly to do with the nature of their lockdown, but it was also about free speech. And people automatically, and these were young people who don't remember Tiananmen Square, might not even know about it, probably no contact with America or the outside world. They intuitively understood that it's unfair that people are making decisions without, bureaucrats are making decisions, politicians are making decisions in which ordinary people who are affected by them have no voice and are harmed by them in ways that, that seem unfair. People understand that courts that are captured are unfair. And they understand in Iran that women having fewer rights than men is unfair. And so there will always be people who understand that fundamental unfairness. I mean, it's a little bit like, where did our founding ideas come from? And they came from the experience of colonial Americans of living under a monarchy. And they, if you read what they were writing then, again, they had access also to philosophy, and they were also thinking in, they borrowed ideas from other places, but it was just their own experience. And I find that almost everywhere people who live in deeply unfair societies where small numbers of people control everything and nobody else has a say, they understand that it's not right. And you don't need to, they don't need to hear that from the United States. But as I say, the Chinese and the Russians and others have identified those ideas with the United States and really are working to undermine American influence and power for that reason.
Yeah, I think it's the desire for freedom, and also then this innate kind of human sense of justice. At the McCain Institute, we actually have a vision statement, a world that is more free, just, free, and safe for all. And so there's security in there as well. But I think that humans also want to make sure that there isn't corruption, that everyone has some kind of free and fair shot at a good life. Now, this is optimistic. I think you and I have identified kind of the universal reason why we should keep doing what we're doing, right, at the McCain Institute, and you should keep writing your books because frankly, if the good humans prevail, we'll all be okay. The problem is, of course, that the autocrats seem to be in the ascendant. There's kind of I mean, it ebbs and flows here in Washington, D.C., but there's a sense, well, those autocrats, the Russians, the Chinese, they're just too strong. We can't stand up to them. They permeated our social media. We don't know how to fight back. Can you talk to us a little bit about how and why the autocrats appear to be successful? And then we can talk after that about what we should be doing.
So, I mean, successful. I mean, even when after I wrote my book, the Syrian regime collapsed, and the Syrian
Right.
regime had been one of the examples in the book of a state that's propped up by other states, because Syria, the Assad Syria, was propped up by the Russians and the Iranians. And nevertheless, it collapsed very fast. Actually, I mean, it's almost exactly a year ago. I think the anniversary is just in a few
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
And it collapsed, um, because once that support was withdrawn, it turned out that almost nobody wanted to fight for it anymore. And again, people saw that the repression was unfair and even in their case, even grotesque, and it ended. So it's not as if all of these regimes last forever, or they're all successful, or they're all prosperous. In fact, I would say rather the opposite. Russia has impoverished itself by fighting this war. The lives of ordinary Russians are not improving. I mean, maybe outside of Moscow, it's a very, very poor country. So you can point to some examples like China, where for a lot of different reasons, the country has become more prosperous. But in the case of China, it's often been the loosening of rules and the loosening of centralization and the allowing of people to become creative or to make their own decisions that has enabled Chinese prosperity, not the dictatorship of the state. I mean, the dictatorship created mass famine in China,
Right.
only a couple of generations ago. So not all of them are successful, and sometimes we overplay their success. I mean, I do think that they have managed to create an authoritarian narrative that does appeal to a lot of Americans and to a
Mhm.
lot of Europeans, not all, but some,
Right.
which has been successful. And this is a narrative about and it, let me just preface it by saying, in a moment when we live in this period of incredible rapid change, everything's changing. The economy changes every week. By next year, all kinds of jobs might disappear because of AI.
Right.
All of us are bombarded with new information all the time. We spend time on our phones looking at this constantly changing, flickering world. We live in an era of huge social change, demographic change, and in that moment, there are authoritarians who have who have created a narrative about how authoritarianism is stable and safe. We can look back onto an earlier time, before all these changes, when everybody, things didn't happen so quickly or so dramatically. We can move back in that direction. I mean, they're almost always backwards looking movements.
Right.
We can look back in that direction. We can recreate it. And this does, in this moment of dramatic change, this idea of going back, this idea of stability, this idea also, I think, for a lot of people, of shutting out all the noise. Let's just have one leader. Let's have one homogenous government. Let's not have to worry about making all these choices.
Right.
I think in that era, then this authoritarian narrative about stability and safety, and they've wrapped it up with traditional families and traditional hierarchies, social hierarchies. I think that has a real appeal. And again, we see it, of course, in the United States and elsewhere. And then I think very specifically, the Russian aggression in Ukraine,
Hmm.
which met with more of a joint response than I think the Russians expected, much more, actually. I mean, the Biden administration did lead a real coalition of the willing. We have defended Ukraine for 4 years.
Right.
The Ukrainians have been unbelievably brave. I mean, despite there's a lot of propaganda around at the moment about Ukraine being about to collapse, and
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
it's not. So,
No.
I read a statistic recently that if Russians continue to move forward at the current rate that they're moving, they'll conquer all of Ukraine in 80 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Like
it's not
one
a
foot in front of the other
it's not a fast movement. But
per day.
I think the military challenge that Russia has presented to us and to Europe took a lot of people by surprise. I mean, it shouldn't have, because it was, saw a version of it earlier in 2014 in Crimea, and then in 2008 in Georgia. Nevertheless, it surprised people. It forced a change of thinking. It created, especially in Europe, a lot of anxiety about whether it's possible to recreate a, heavily armed Europe, and should we do that, and what's the cost. And I think that war has also changed a lot of conversations and created a huge amount of anxiety that
Right.
wasn't there
Yeah.
before.
And also, of course, the way that the Russians fought it, the fact that there has not yet been justice or accountability for the human rights abuses, because I was in the Pentagon in 2014 with the first invasion of Ukraine, which was very different. Not that there weren't human rights abuses, there were, but they weren't telegraphed all around the world, and they weren't on the scale, and they weren't as blatant. And this has continued, and the international community appears, I don't think that we are not doing anything, and I don't think that we are somehow unable to counter Russia. It takes time. And so it appears at the moment that Russia is getting away literally with murder.
Yeah,
But
and I should stress that one of the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine was for exactly this reason. So in their mind, I mean, it's a war, but it's also a part of their narrative. It's also
right,
a part of demonstrating that they don't care about international law. They don't care about the Geneva Conventions on War. They don't care about human rights. They're going to kidnap thousands of Ukrainian children and brag about it. I mean, they have a minister for children who's stated that she herself has an adopted Ukrainian child. I mean, we don't know what does adopted mean in those circumstances, or whose child that was, and so on. So they are very blatantly seeking to defy a lot of the rules that were written and unwritten, especially in Europe, after the Second World War. And that's on purpose. So they're trying to show that this era of, American dominance is over, and the ideas that we could work out, we could do diplomacy and solve problems without going to war with each other, again, especially in Europe, that this is over.
right.
And I think so. I think it was a deliberate challenge to American hegemony, and to also the ideas that have been associated with the United States since 1945.
Right. And I think the idea that Russia is winning, or that Russia can win, and that there's nothing we can do about it, also the misinformation to confuse
Yep.
populations is part of this. So I wonder if I can ask you the question, which I know you probably get asked all the time, but it's important because people are watching this in America and maybe around the world. Why should citizens care about what the autocracies are doing if they can sit in their country, let's say the United States, or I don't know, Paraguay, some other country, and not be bothered by Russia, at least territorially? Why should they care?
Well, first of all, Russia has plenty of means of influencing your life, even if you're not here. I mean, we saw a few days ago when the administration of X, formerly known as Twitter,
Oh, right.
decided to reveal the origins of,
Yeah,
where the accounts on X are based. And lo and behold, lots of, MAGA America, We Love America accounts were based in Nigeria or India, and lots of them were in Eastern Europe. And so
right,
we've known that the Russians are interested in shaping our social media and in shaping our conversation. Everybody's interested, stipulate, but especially the Russians, and they've been doing it for more than a decade. So they're already here. They're already influencing your life, and they're
right,
shaping your political conversation, even if you don't know it. They're also here in the sense of, what we sometimes call dark money, or anonymous money, or anonymous companies. Those are also shaping our economy in ways that we don't know. Property in New York City and Miami. I have a section in my book where I talk about some investments that were made by a kind of pre-2014 Ukrainian oligarch who made a whole bunch of investments all across the Midwest, and then essentially abandoned them, and it resulted in some factories collapsing and so on, because it was part of a money laundering scheme, or a money hiding money concealing scheme.
Right.
And,
Americans lost jobs.
Americans lost jobs.
Yeah.
Our economy is connected to the world economy, whether we like it or not. Our conversation is part of an international conversation, whether we like it or not. Our politics are shaped by the politics of other countries, and our economy is as well. I mean, we also have, we have a special interest in our allies because our allies are, firstly, those are the countries with whom we do the most business. I mean, a lot of American
Right.
prosperity is connected to America's ability to do business in Europe, and vice versa, in South Korea, Japan. These are, these are the places where American companies have done the best historically, and it's our interrelationship with them, our, the symbiosis, really, the symbiotic relationship that we enjoy with these alliances that's been a large part of our prosperity since the Second World War. And of course, those are also the countries that, in case of an emergency or an American need to defend itself, would help us, at least theoretically.
Right.
And that did happen after 9/11. There were, the NATO treaty was invoked, and European countries came to the aid of the United States. And understanding that there are these mutual relationships that we're part of, means that we also are concerned about the security of our friends. And our friends are in Europe, and a Russian conquest of Ukraine would threaten the physical safety, but also the economic stability, and the political stability of Europe in ways that could eventually be catastrophic for us. And it's really
Right.
important to understand. It seems far away, but these things are connected, and they are. And they're part of who we are as Americans, how we define ourselves in the world, and they're also part of our own, as I said, prosperity.
Yeah, if Russia could expand into Europe and take over there economically and politically, they would challenge us to a much higher level, and it
Yep.
would be existential to us as well. I think it's interesting, though, this question of alliances. We believe that they are ironclad and that we will come, as you said, after 9/11, when the Al-Qaeda attacked the United States and we went to Afghanistan to eliminate Al-Qaeda as a threat. Our European allies, our NATO allies came with us, and actually many other countries did as well. Now, Venezuela. Venezuela would probably love to have an alliance. Can you talk a little bit? And I know we're veering now into current events, and maybe if we have time, I'll go back to Ukraine as well. But talk about Venezuela and what you see unfolding there, because I'm sure that Nicolas Maduro would love to have a durable alliance. He is getting help from the autocrats, so tell us how that is working. But he doesn't have an alliance. And so what do you predict moving forward, where we have a carrier strike group, U.S. carrier strike group off the coast of Venezuela, where it appears that President Trump is directly threatening Maduro and telling him to leave the country. Can you just talk a little bit about how the autocrats factor into all this?
So let me firstly say that I look at Venezuela from a kind of split screen perspective. On the one hand, I know a lot of Venezuelans. I've been there. I was there about 4 years ago, and I've had, followed events there pretty closely. It is a very, very ugly political system.
Right.
This was the country that was the richest country in South America, and first Chavez and then Maduro have made it into the poorest. There are more economic refugees from Venezuela than there are more refugees from Ukraine, even though Ukraine is a bigger country and Venezuela is not at war. And so there are many reasons to hope that Maduro leaves and
Yeah.
that he is replaced by the legitimately elected government of Venezuela. So another important thing to understand about Venezuela is they did have elections last year. And they do have a legitimate president who was elected, and who, not only that, they can prove he was elected because the
Right.
Venezuelan opposition had people inside voting, counting the votes, and they produced these so-called tally papers that show how people really voted. And so there is a legitimate leader.
In exile in Spain.
He's in exile in
Yeah.
Spain, and the leader of his party is in hiding in Venezuela, and she's just won the Nobel Prize. Maria
And she also got
Yovanovitch.
our McCain Institute award prize earlier.
Right. I interviewed her actually a few months ago. I republished it when she won the prize. So she, she's a so it is a country that, I mean, when you say regime change, I mean the collapse of this regime would be hugely beneficial to Venezuelans, to most other South Americans. I mean, it's not something that we should be, that we need to protect or feel sorry for. I mean, my qualms about the what's happening in Venezuela are threefold. One is that I don't hear the Trump administration using this language of democracy. I don't know what exactly is their motive in Venezuela. I worry that it's primarily about oil,
Mhm.
which is not a good reason to change a country's government. And if that's the motive,
By
won't
force.
necessarily produce a better government. I also worry about the example being set. I mean, the specter of U.S. ships off the coast of Venezuela looks to me a lot like what the Chinese would like to do to Taiwan.
Yeah.
Um, and so the precedent being set by the way we're going about this is disturbing to me. And I worry, and this is more amorphous, I worry that it's part of a strange idea about the Western Hemisphere, that there's some, I don't know, that we need to have some macho role in the Western Hemisphere and we need to withdraw from the rest of the world and Venezuela will somehow prove it. I mean, this is just stuff I pick up from, going down rabbit holes on the internet. I mean, it's not something anybody's ever said, but there's a piece of of people around this administration who think like that. And I worry that that's, it would undermine all the alliances that we were just talking about and would ultimately be very bad for the United States. So there are a lot of things that have me worried about this, whatever it's going to be, but which we don't know. Um, it's also true, again, Maduro it's a very weak regime. It's very poor. The people around Maduro are probably, there are a lot of them, I'm sure, who have dubious loyalty. I mean, after the Syrian regime fell a year ago, I wrote a piece saying, this is exactly what a collapse in Venezuela would look like. That once
Mhm.
the kingpin is gone, then it's going to turn out nobody ever liked him, and you could get change very fast. I think that's possible there. But it's also true that Maduro does have Russian weapons. He does have Chinese support. I mean, he does have supposedly Cuban agents around him all the time at the moment. Um, I don't know. I can't pinpoint the nature of that support, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's trying to call in favors from his network to help him survive, or at least to help him give the United States a hard time. So
But Assad,
there,
Assad prop.
there are sort of
Go ahead.
multiple ways in which this could go wrong, and one of them is that Maduro could turn out to have more ability to hit back than we think he does.
So more support than Assad had from those
It's
autocrats.
it's well, it's not it's yeah, well, no, well, Assad had primarily Russian and Iranian support, and those Russia was too preoccupied in Ukraine, and Iran had just been hit. Hezbollah really was the force that had just been destroyed by the Israelis, so they were very weakened. I mean, it's true that Russia can't give Maduro the kind of support they might have once done, but I don't know. As I said, they have friends in China, they have friends in elsewhere, and we'll see. Friends in Cuba in particular.
Right, right. So in the time that we have left, so we'll put a pin in it, see what happens with Venezuela. I think obviously we want a transition there. We would like a peaceful transition,
Yes.
with Maria Corina Machado leading the way, and the U.S. of course providing support the minute that happens. And of course there are many things we can do using our soft power internally in Venezuela, which I know we have done in the past. Moving to Ukraine. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see the war in Ukraine ending, kind of in the best case scenario. Right now, the two sides are so far apart, and I'm sure that people get confused by, frankly, our media's desire to kind of play up every little, plane trip. But can you talk about, what would it take for real durable peace in Ukraine?
Yeah, so you're right. I'm all like you. I'm very worried about the way we talk about the ongoing negotiations because I keep saying this every time I'm asked. So as far as I can tell, based on what I've heard, I have never heard the Russians say that they want to end the war. I have
Correct.
heard the Ukrainians say they would accept a ceasefire on current lines, just stop fighting right now. I've never heard the Russians say anything like that. I've also never heard the Russians say that they recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, that they recognize the legitimacy of President Zelensky.
No.
I'm just not hearing that. Um, there are reasons to think that they are in trouble in various ways. They are now losing on this, in this many, many months long attempt to take Pokrovsk, which is this nothing, it's a city you never heard of before the war. And they're losing between 15 and 20,000 people a month, a month.
That's
That's
a
killed
crime
and
in and of
wounded.
itself.
That's
Yeah.
killed and wounded. But try to imagine that number in the United States or anywhere really. Imagine the level, the scale of national crisis if that was happening. So they are, and they are, there are limits to their ability to continue fighting. They can't do it forever. Um, but the main point is that the war is really only over in a real sense when they understand that they can't win. In other words, when they understand that their resources are limited, as I've said, when they understand that the Ukrainians have allies who won't give up on them, when they understand that they aren't going to capture all of Ukraine and make it into a province of Russia, because that remains officially their goal. And the best I can say is that when this moment comes, when they reach this moment that they understand it, we will know.
Hmm.
Hear it, we'll see it, it'll be obvious. And I just don't think we've reached that moment yet. And so the danger now, the thing I'm worried about is the Ukrainians being forced into some kind of peace deal that makes them vulnerable to another invasion. So
Right.
a deal in which the Russians are given control of territory they have now, but also are given territory that they haven't conquered yet, which is part of the 28-point plan that Steve Witkoff produced some days ago. Some deal where they can force elections in Ukraine, where they can prevent the Ukrainians from being able to defend themselves in the future. I mean, this is just a recipe for another invasion. This is
Right.
just
Right.
a way of saying, the invasion will continue as soon as we rest for a while and, rebuild our forces and import some more people from Central Asia to fight for us or whatever it is that they're going to do.
Right.
That would be a very dangerous. I mean, any ceasefire or peace that leaves Ukraine very weak, unable to defend itself, would be an unviable state because as soon as you open the borders, people would leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
You would not be able to invest there. A lot of people have made the comparison between Ukraine and South Korea, which is another country that, some of its territory was occupied by hostile dictatorship. But South Korea has been viable for half a century because U.S. troops are there.
Yeah.
U.S. troops are there and they remain there and are there and they're part of what keeps the peace in that region. And some version of that, you would need I don't know, there have been a lot of different formula have been thrown around. I mean, you would need Western troops or you would need European troops or you would need something that ensured people felt that Ukraine was going to be stable and the war was not going to continue. And so far the deals that the Russians have put forward don't allow for that. And so the Ukrainians saying they're unacceptable isn't because they're somehow stubborn and they don't want to end the war. It's not even because they wouldn't do some kind of deal about where the border lies,
Correct.
because I think they would. It's because they don't want the war to end in such a way that it restarts again, or
Yeah.
that people think it will restart again. And so that's because then you might as well just keep fighting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
so I just don't see that we've got there yet. I don't see that there is an agreement that allows Ukraine to remain a viable state yet.
yeah. And my own view is that the US has to be part of the security guarantee because, and a critical component of it, frankly, I think Article 5 or a bilateral Article 5, short of those two things right now, if Vladimir Putin's still in the Kremlin, he will not be deterred by the Europeans. So that gets me to my last question, because I could talk to you all day, and it's like reading one of your articles, but getting an instant answer to a follow-on question. the Europeans, how do you think they are doing in terms of deterring Putin? Because obviously, if there's peace in Ukraine, but it's not a real peace, if it's just a ceasefire, then there's a real problem for Europe. So a lot hinges on Europe being able to deter Putin. How do you think they're doing?
So first of all, I don't think most Americans know this, but Europeans have, over the course of the war, given more money to Ukraine than we have, than the United States. And right now, since the beginning of this year, actually, they've given almost everything. The United States hasn't been helping
Right.
Ukraine
Correct.
financially since January, and the Europeans have done everything. So they actually have stepped up, and the war is continuing because of them. And now
Great points.
most
Thank you.
most people also don't know that the Ukrainians now make a large percentage of their own weapons, especially their own drones, both short range ones and these long range ones that can hit Russian factories and refineries. And a lot of that is produced with European money.
Mhm.
So the Europeans there's already been a big shift. There's already been a big mental shift, I think, especially in Germany,
Mhm.
obviously in Poland, Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, UK, and France, at least for the moment under Macron, are pretty devoted to making sure Ukraine is a viable state because they understand the security implications for themselves.
Right.
I think that has finally gotten through. I mean, partly the Russians have helped send that message because of these Russian sabotage acts that take place all over Europe, also don't get much coverage in the US. Russian weird drone attacks on European airports, also Russian, information games, information warfare all over Europe. There's lots of exposures of that as well. And so I think people feel, especially, as I said, in the Baltic region, Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Germany, UK, Netherlands. I mean, these are all countries that feel very much like that this is a huge challenge to them, and they understand it's important to them. So yeah, I do think they would. I do think they would be able to be a deterrent, and I do think they would be able to work together. I mean, what they don't have is unity of command. There isn't
Right.
there
Yeah.
isn't still a president of Europe, and I think that is it's a problem for them. I mean, there isn't one person they can send to negotiate in the way that the United States can. And so maybe that weakens their ability to be part of the diplomatic process. But as a player in the war, they're much bigger than we are.
Yeah. And it has been impressive to see them really jump in on the issue of Ukraine, to
Hmm.
fly to Washington, to meet with President Trump, to make sure that President Zelensky has their support. Each time the negotiation looks like it's taking a turn that's not in Ukraine or, frankly, European or U.S. national interest, they are able to, and they have really made an effort to an effective effort. I mean, they've kept things on track, if you will, so far.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you further, but we are so grateful that you have been able to make time to talk to us today, Anne. I hope you keep writing books so we can have you back on Authors and Insights. For our audience, thank you for tuning in. We will keep you posted on new and upcoming Authors and Insights. Come to McCainInstitute.org to see what we're up to. Follow us on social media, all the usual places, and send us your ideas for people you want to see who represent character-driven leadership and the ideas and the principles that John McCain believed in for the United States and for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.